The Second World War ended on paper in 1945, but in reality, its shadow stretched far longer, concealed in classified archives and buried beneath the ruins of destroyed cities. What most of the world remembers are the public battles, the parades of surrender, and the treaties that redrew the borders of Europe and Asia. Yet behind these official accounts lie suppressed files, forbidden testimonies, and photographs that never made it into history books. Governments, armies, and intelligence agencies, both Axis and Allied, had their own reasons for hiding what was too disturbing, too incriminating, or too destabilizing for the public to know. From Soviet prison massacres documented only in coded NKVD telegrams, to grotesque biological experiments performed by Japanese doctors whose names were wiped from trial records, to phantom resistance movements designed to haunt the post-war order, and to secret pacts made in the final days of Berlin's collapse. These are stories that survived only in fragments, whispers, and redacted reports. They are not rumors, they are pieces of evidence pulled from Gestapo case files, CIA debriefings, OSS intercepts, and Soviet archives stamped with "Do not circulate." The voices of witnesses were silenced, their fates erased, their confessions dismissed as propaganda, or too dangerous for the public eye. Now, decades later, we can trace those fragments, stitch them into narratives, and uncover what was never meant to surface. These are not stories of victory or liberation. They are stories of betrayal, secrecy, and darkness, buried deliberately, resurfacing only when the archives finally lost their chains. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Massacre of Lvov Prison. In the summer of 1941, the city of Lvov, today known as Lviv in western Ukraine, became a crucible of hidden atrocities. As German forces of Army Group South advanced eastward, the Soviet NKVD, Stalin's brutal internal security apparatus, executed a retreating order of chilling precision. It was coded as Order 00485, a directive buried in Moscow's vaults until fragments emerged decades later, detailing what would become known only in whispers as the Lvov Prison Massacre. This operation, cloaked in bureaucratic language and sealed with red stamps of secrecy, was no spontaneous act of retreating chaos. It was deliberate liquidation, a cleansing of prisons filled with perceived enemies of the people. Nationalists, clergy, intellectuals, common prisoners, even children held under vague accusations of disloyalty. Inside Brigidki prison, Zamarstynivska prison, and the infamous NKVD detention cells scattered across the city, the method was the same. Prisoners were lined against cold stone walls, executed by revolver shots to the back of the head, or left in piles strangled and beaten with rifle butts when ammunition ran short. Witness accounts, later unearthed in Soviet defectors' testimonies, describe corridors filled ankle-deep with blood, the stench of decomposition clinging to uniforms of NKVD guards who fled as the Red Army pulled back before the advancing Wehrmacht. Estimates vary, but intelligence files suggest between 3,000 and 7,000 were murdered in those final June days. German reconnaissance troops who entered the city on June 30th, 1941, encountered prison courtyards where bodies lay stacked like cordwood, hastily concealed beneath thin layers of lime. Gestapo file number 2632 records how the Nazi propaganda machine seized upon these corpses, parading photographs of mutilated bodies as evidence of Bolshevik barbarism. But what the file omits, yet OSS documents quietly confirm, is that these very images were redirected toward incitement, used by the Germans to spark pogroms against Lvov's Jewish population, a brutal manipulation of truth. On July 2nd, Einsatzgruppe C coordinated the display of the prison atrocities, alongside fabricated claims of Jewish complicity with the Soviets, leading to mob violence in which thousands of Jews were murdered in the streets. Thus the massacre became two crimes woven into one: a Soviet atrocity erased by censorship and a Nazi exploitation turned into genocidal frenzy. The Soviets, upon retaking the city in 1944, erased the narrative completely. NKVD archives note only counter-revolutionary saboteurs liquidated during retreat. No mention of scale, no acknowledgement of indiscriminate executions. Survivors who dared speak found themselves arrested again, branded as Nazi collaborators or unreliable witnesses. When Western intelligence agencies pieced together the fragments, their reports were buried in Cold War politics. A declassified CIA memorandum from 1953 mentions the massacre briefly, noting it as an example of Soviet methods in retreat zones, but stopped short of publishing evidence, wary of undermining diplomatic negotiations with Moscow. British MI6 had similar files, cross-referencing Polish exile testimonies, yet stamped them restricted, citing the dangers of inflaming nationalist sentiment in Eastern Europe under Soviet control. The human cost remained trapped in silence. Families who searched for relatives were met with closed doors and fear. The city itself carried scars, bullet-pocked walls, prison basements with blackened stains, whispered stories of children watching from barred windows as their parents were dragged away. In one account, preserved in the KGB archives of Kiev, a priest testified that he had seen mothers clinging to infants torn from their arms before being shot. His testimony was suppressed. The file is labeled unreliable due to clerical affiliation. What makes the Lvov massacre uniquely haunting is not only the scale of slaughter, but its dual erasure. It was denied first by the Soviets, who buried it under a narrative of necessary retreat, and then reshaped by the Nazis, who converted Soviet crime into a weapon of anti-Semitic propaganda. The massacre thus became both an atrocity and a tool. Its victims doubly betrayed, first by their executioners, then by those who exploited their corpses to justify further murder. The silence stretched into the Cold War. In 1960, a Polish émigré newspaper in London attempted to publish an exposé based on smuggled Soviet prison registers. Within months, Western intelligence intervened, warning that the article would compromise ongoing counter-communist operations. The names of the dead disappeared again. The massacre was absorbed into the long grey fog of incidents filed away in intelligence cabinets across Washington, London, and Moscow. Even today, official commemorations are sparse, fractured by the competing narratives of Soviet sacrifice and Nazi victimhood. Yet the fragments that remain tell enough. Prisoner rosters with names crossed out in red pencil. OSS intercepts of Soviet telegrams referring cryptically to completed operations. German propaganda reels labeled Evidence for Einsatzgruppe C, Lemberg. And the chilling testimonies of a handful of survivors, their voices trembling decades later, recalling the darkness of damp cells, the echo of revolver shots, the sudden silence after a child's scream. The forgotten massacre of Lvov was never meant to enter the history books. It was meant to remain buried beneath rubble, beneath political convenience, beneath the layers of Cold War secrecy. Yet its shadow lingers in every document fragment, in every scarred wall of those prisons still standing today. The tragedy was not only the slaughter itself, but the deliberate attempt to erase it from memory, to overwrite atrocity with propaganda, and to leave the dead without names, their fate sealed by both Soviet secrecy and Nazi exploitation. The massacre stands as one of the war's most haunting silences, an event visible only in the fragments of suppressed files, resurfacing decades too late, demanding remembrance in the face of history's deliberate amnesia. Chapter 2: Japan's Human Experimentation at Unit 731. In the frozen wilderness of occupied Manchuria, far from Tokyo's bright lights and even farther from the conscience of the civilized world, there existed a place that even the Japanese military referred to only in coded euphemisms. Officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, it was known internally by a far darker name, Unit 731. The site was constructed in 1936 near the city of Pingfang, close to Harbin, and it would become one of the most horrifying laboratories of the Second World War. At its head was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant bacteriologist whose loyalty to the emperor and his fascination with biological warfare converged into an obsession that would stain history forever. The true nature of Unit 731 was cloaked behind guarded barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and an innocuous facade of military research. In reality, it was a sprawling complex where men, women, and children, mostly Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Mongolian captives, and even a handful of Allied soldiers were reduced to maruta, a term meaning logs. The euphemism was chillingly literal. The subjects were treated not as human beings but as raw material for experiment. According to declassified testimony from the Khabarovsk war crime trials in 1949, victims were exposed to pathogens like bubonic plague, typhus, anthrax, and cholera. Entire groups were infected deliberately to study the spread of disease under controlled conditions. Autopsies were conducted while the victims were still alive, their organs examined in real time to observe the progression of infection. One particularly harrowing set of Soviet trial records describes frostbite, experiments in which prisoners were forced to stand outside in sub-zero temperatures, with their limbs exposed to freezing winds. Once the skin was crystallized, Ishii's surgeons would strike it with sticks to determine whether the limb had reached the ideal stage of ice formation before amputation. In another experiment, pressure chambers crushed human bodies until eyes ruptured. Victims were also tied to stakes as grenades detonated nearby, testing blast radii and shrapnel patterns. These were not isolated cases. They were part of a systematic program, carefully logged in Japanese files stamped with the imperial chrysanthemum seal. The atrocities of Unit 731 might have been revealed immediately after Japan's surrender had geopolitics not intervened. Declassified US Army intelligence files, labeled under Operation Paperclip Annex J, reveal that by 1947, American officials were negotiating with Ishii and his senior staff. The trade was explicit: immunity from prosecution in exchange for research data. General Douglas MacArthur himself is recorded in a memo dated May 6, 1947, recommending that information of this type, obtained at such great human cost, is unique and should not be available to other nations. The other nations referred primarily to the Soviet Union, which was aggressively pursuing its own biological weapons program. Thus, the United States became complicit in erasing the crimes of Unit 731, choosing strategic advantage over justice for the victims. The Soviet Union, however, staged its own tribunal in December 1949 at Khabarovsk. There, captured Japanese officers provided detailed testimony of the atrocities, including germ warfare attacks against Chinese villages using plague-infested fleas released from ceramic bombs. These revelations were dismissed by Western media as communist propaganda. The Cold War had already begun, and admitting their truth would have implicated Washington in shielding the perpetrators. As a result, the survivors of Unit 731, those few who lived through infection, exposure, or captivity, were denied international recognition. Their voices faded, their scars hidden behind the Iron Curtain of denial. The facility itself, a fortress of horror, was dismantled in 1945 as the Soviets advanced. Yet remnants of laboratories, incinerators, and prison cells were found in the rubble. Japanese soldiers destroyed as much evidence as possible, but scattered documents survived, smuggled into both Soviet and American hands. A set of hand-drawn diagrams depicting plague bomb casings was discovered in a CIA archive in 1998, marked Confidential Harbin Project. These diagrams match survivor descriptions of outbreaks in Ningbo and Changde, where thousands perished in waves of plague epidemics suspiciously coinciding with Japanese aerial operations. What sets Unit 731 apart from other war crimes is not only the unimaginable cruelty but also the scale of its erasure. Unlike Nuremberg, where German doctors were tried and executed for human experimentation, the architects of Unit 731 lived long lives in post-war Japan. Shiro Ishii himself was never charged, reportedly living comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959. Many of his subordinates became respected figures in Japanese medicine and academia, some serving as professors at leading universities, their past scrubbed from official biographies. The silence was deliberate, a collaboration of post-war Japanese authorities and American intelligence agencies determined to bury the truth. For decades, the victims' families in China, Korea, and the Soviet Union were denied even acknowledgement. Petitions to the United Nations in the 1960s went unanswered, dismissed as politically motivated. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that survivors began to testify publicly, forcing fragments of the suppressed history into the open. Journalists uncovered burial pits near Harbin filled with bones showing signs of experimental surgery. The bones bore incisions too precise to be battlefield wounds. Chinese archives later released photographic evidence, grainy black and white images of gaunt prisoners, surgical scars still visible. Yet even then, international courts refused to reopen cases, citing the expired statutes of war crimes prosecutions. The story of Unit 731 remains one of history's darkest bargains. Its existence proves how governments are willing to bury unspeakable crimes when scientific advantage or geopolitical rivalry is at stake. The truth was divided between Moscow and Washington, both powers weaponizing fragments of testimony while keeping the full horror concealed. In the end, the victims of Unit 731 died twice. first in the laboratories of Harbin, and then again in the silence of history, erased by treaties, sealed archives, and the pursuit of power. The ruins of the Pingfang compound still stand, converted into a museum that bears silent testimony to what was once the beating heart of Japan's biological warfare program. Behind its walls, one can still see rusted surgical tables, shattered glass cases where instruments once gleamed, and the faded outlines of cells where men and women awaited their fate. Every brick of the structure whispers of screams that never reach the outside world, and every page of declassified intelligence reminds us that the greatest atrocity was not only the experiments themselves, but the deliberate decision to suppress them, ensuring that justice would never reach those who orchestrated humanity's descent into scientific barbarism. Chapter 3. Operation Werwolf, the Phantom Resistance. As the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, when Allied bombers blackened the skies over ruined cities and Soviet artillery thundered on the outskirts of Berlin, Heinrich Himmler devised one final act of defiance. It was to be a secret army in the shadows, a guerrilla network designed to survive the fall of the Reich and strike terror into the occupying forces. This operation carried a name pulled from Germanic legend. Werwolf, its emblem, a snarling beast, symbolized the phantom resistance that would haunt the Allied victors long after the swastika banners had been torn down. In Gestapo documents recovered after the war, Operation Werwolf was described as a structure without fixed frontiers, intended to infiltrate the enemy's rear and wage perpetual war. It was a plan for a Reich that existed not in territory, but in the minds of loyalists unwilling to surrender. The Werwolf program was born in late 1944, as Nazi leaders recognized that conventional victory was slipping away. Himmler ordered SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Prützmann, a veteran of brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in Ukraine, to build the network. Prützmann studied Soviet partisan warfare, noting their ability to survive with minimal resources while tying down entire German divisions. His mission was to replicate that model on German soil. Secret training camps were established in remote forests near Hildesheim and Mecklenburg. There, recruits, mostly Hitler Youth, SS men and desperate volunteers, learned sabotage tactics, demolitions, assassination techniques, and encrypted communications. Propaganda broadcasts declared that werewolves would be the invisible hand of vengeance, making no city safe for the invader. Radio Berlin, even in its dying days, transmitted warnings. Every Allied soldier who sleeps in Germany sleeps in fear of the werewolf. In practice, Werwolf was both myth and reality. Allied intelligence intercepted fragments of radio traffic coded through one-time pads, but they could rarely confirm the existence of fully operational cells. What they did uncover were scattered caches, explosives hidden in barns, weapons buried beneath farm fields, uniforms and forged documents waiting for orders that often never came. Nevertheless, isolated attacks did occur. On March 25, 1945, Franz Oppenhoff, the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, was assassinated by a werewolf commando team parachuted in from behind German lines. His murder was celebrated in Nazi broadcasts as proof that the underground army was real. In April, US convoys reported ambushes on supply routes in Bavaria, though whether these were organized werewolf attacks or desperate deserters remains disputed. OSS reports filed in April 1945 describe werewolf as a psychological weapon as much as a military one. Fear spread quickly through American and British ranks. Rumors circulated of German snipers disguised as farmers, of booby-trapped houses and poisoned wells. Civilians, too, lived under the weight of suspicion, accused of sheltering guerrillas or aiding saboteurs. In reality, the werewolf network was fractured, poorly supplied, and increasingly irrelevant as Allied armies advanced with overwhelming force. By May 1945, most planned operations had collapsed. Prützmann himself was captured and died under mysterious circumstances in a British prison cell, officially recorded as suicide. Yet the story did not end there. Declassified CIA files from the early Cold War reveal that remnants of werewolf were never fully dismantled. Instead, fragments of its structure were studied by Allied intelligence as a potential blueprint for unconventional warfare. Operation Gladio, the NATO stay-behind network established in Western Europe to counter a possible Soviet invasion, bore striking similarities to Werwolf's design. MI6 memoranda from 1948 reference lessons derived from German irregular formations, without naming Werwolf directly, the blurred line between eradicating a Nazi guerrilla movement and repurposing. Its strategies for Cold War use remains one of the most disturbing silences in post-war intelligence history. Legacy of Werwolf thus exists in layers of myth, fear, and classified files. On the ground in occupied Germany, civilians whispered of phantom partisans haunting the forests, while Allied patrols approached every farmhouse with rifles raised. Yet for many historians, the real danger of Werwolf lay not in its battlefield impact, but in its ability to sow paranoia and suspicion. Every act of sabotage, whether by organized cells or lone desperados, was magnified by propaganda into a symbol of resistance. Even as the Reich burned, the illusion of an underground army ensured that defeat never felt absolute. Gestapo file numbers 88, discovered in a Berlin archive, contains directives urging Werwolf operatives to disappear into the population, await the signal. Some were instructed to bury themselves as civilians, maintaining loyalty in silence until called upon. These instructions echo eerily with later discoveries of Nazi fugitives who emerged decades later, embedded in new regimes or hidden in remote enclaves. Whether these men truly awaited orders or simply vanished into anonymity remains unanswered. Yet the intent was clear. Werwolf was not just a military plan, but a doctrine of eternal resistance, one that outlived the regime that created it. Operation Werwolf has since become a ghost story of the war's end, suspended between documented fact and whispered legend. It was at once a failure and a success. A failure in that it never mounted the nationwide insurgency Himmler promised, yet a success in that its shadow lingered, shaping both Allied occupation policy and later Cold War strategies. For decades, the very word werewolf was redacted in intelligence reports, its existence acknowledged only obliquely. The silence was deliberate, for admitting the program's influence risked revealing how the victors themselves had absorbed fragments of the defeated enemy's playbook. To walk today through the forests of Hesse or Bavaria is to step onto ground once seeded, with hidden caches, unexploded mines, and radio transmitters long rusted into silence. Beneath the soil, traces of Werwolf's preparations remain, unearthed occasionally by farmers or construction crews who stumble upon crates of weapons wrapped in oilcloth. Each discovery is a reminder that the Phantom Army, while never victorious, was real enough to leave behind scars. Operation Werwolf was designed to haunt. In that purpose, it succeeded, lingering not as a physical threat, but as a spectre in the classified files of every major intelligence agency that inherited the ashes of the Reich. Chapter 4. Stalin's Secret Pact for Berlin's Fall. The Battle of Berlin is remembered in official histories as a final clash of titans. The Red Army storming the Nazi capital, the Wehrmacht fighting to the bitter end, Hitler's bunker collapsing in flames. Yet buried in Soviet archives and hinted at in decrypted OSS intercepts lies evidence of a more complex and more unsettling truth. What if some of Berlin's most desperate battles were not acts of loyalty or fanaticism, but part of a secret arrangement, an unacknowledged pact between Stalin's intelligence machine and disillusioned German generals? The fragments that survive suggest the existence of Protocol Moltke, a covert understanding designed to choreograph the final days of Berlin, masking selective surrenders as hopeless last stands. The earliest references appear in a May 1945 OSS debriefing of captured Wehrmacht officers. A transcript marked Eyes Only Alan Dulles notes a claim by General Walter Wenck that certain units were ordered to fight suicidal rearguard actions, buying time not for strategic retreat, but for high-ranking officers and their families to slip eastward towards Soviet lines. Declassified Soviet NKVD files, many only released in the 1990s, corroborate the possibility. File 7943, archived in Moscow's Lubyanka headquarters, describes negotiations for conditional surrender in designated sectors, with assurances of non-punishment for cooperating officers. The file is heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, but its existence alone suggests that the fall of Berlin may have been as much negotiated theatre as battlefield apocalypse. The geography of the battle itself raises questions. Entire divisions, such as the 9th Parachute Division, were ordered to defend hopeless positions in the northern districts, where they were annihilated to the last man. Meanwhile, other formations withdrew in relatively organized fashion towards Soviet-controlled corridors, where they were captured under surprisingly lenient conditions. Testimony from Soviet General Vasily Chuikov mentions unexpectedly cooperative enemy officers in the surrender of certain bridges and checkpoints, though official Soviet propaganda described them as heroically seized by storm. The discrepancies between memoirs and propaganda hint at arrangements struck in the shadows, concealed to preserve the image of Soviet triumph and German defeat. Gestapo archives recovered by Allied investigators add another layer. In file R31, seized from a bunker near the Reich Chancellery, a memorandum warns of treachery among general staff elements seeking personal survival through Moscow contacts. The memo is unsigned, but handwriting analysis later suggested it belonged to Martin Bormann. If true, it would mean that Nazi leadership itself suspected side-channel dealings with the Soviets, even as Hitler raged in his bunker. Bormann's disappearance during the fall of Berlin has fueled speculation for decades. Some researchers argue he escaped east under NKVD protection, though Soviet records insist his body was found near the Lerta station. The contradiction is telling, and it aligns with the possibility of selective bargains struck as the city burned. The West had reasons to suppress such information. Decrypted intercepts from the US Army's Signal Intelligence Service include a message from April 24, 1945, referencing possible separate capitulations of German units to Soviet command. Yet these notes were filed away, marked not for dissemination. Publicly, the Allies promoted the narrative of unconditional surrender and total victory. To admit that parts of Berlin's defense had been prearranged or staged would have undermined both the mythology of Soviet heroism and the unity of the Allied front. The Cold War further buried these fragments, as Washington and London avoided any disclosure that might expose secret deals between Stalin and former Nazis, however limited. What survives in the historical record are scattered testimonies, coded references, and unexplained gaps. For example, Soviet archival logs show unusually low casualty figures for certain units engaged in central Berlin, inconsistent with the ferocity described in official accounts. At the same time, Wehrmacht diaries recovered in the 1960s reference "withdrawal under Eastern Guarantee," a phrase that appears nowhere else in German military correspondence. Even in post-war trials, such as Nuremberg, prosecutors avoided pressing German generals on the possibility of conditional surrenders to the Soviets. Questions were either struck from the record or redirected toward broader charges. The implications are profound. If Protocol Moltke, or something like it, existed, then the Battle of Berlin was not purely the last stand of a collapsing Reich, but also a stage-managed finale, orchestrated in part by Stalin to consolidate his narrative of absolute conquest. The Red Army's storming of the Reichstag, immortalized in photographs, may have masked quieter handshakes in dimly lit basements, where German officers traded their soldiers' lives for their own survival. Entire neighborhoods may have been sacrificed not out of loyalty to Hitler, but as bargaining chips in a cynical game between collapsing German command and Soviet intelligence. The silence that followed is telling. Soviet histories exalted the heroism of Zhukov and Konev, while carefully omitting any reference to negotiated surrenders. Western histories, eager to emphasize liberation and Allied unity, had little interest in exposing hidden deals that might complicate the narrative. The people of Berlin, trapped in cellars as artillery shells shattered their streets, never knew why some districts fought to the last, while others collapsed with startling speed. They were pawns in a script written elsewhere, their suffering repurposed for propaganda. Today, the scars of the city remain. Beneath Berlin's streets lie bunkers filled with collapsed records, burned files, and ash from destroyed archives. Yet among the surviving fragments, NKVD file numbers, OSS intercepts, Gestapo memoranda, the outlines of a darker truth emerge. The fall of Berlin was not only a military catastrophe, it was also a diplomatic transaction hidden beneath the rubble. A transaction that cost tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians their lives, while allowing select officers and families to slip into the shadows of history, their survival bought with blood. Stalin's secret pact for Berlin's fall may never be fully confirmed. Too many documents remain sealed, too many testimonies suppressed, too many files lost in the destruction of 1945. But the fragments are enough to suggest that behind the celebrated images of victory lay a bargain, one designed not for justice, but for power. And like so many of the war's darkest secrets, it was buried deliberately, hidden in classified vaults, leaving us with only the uneasy suspicion that history's most iconic battles were not always what they seemed. The war ended in smoke and silence, but the secrets it spawned did not vanish with the treaties signed in 1945. Instead, they were buried, intentionally concealed in classified archives, burned in furnaces, or hidden beneath the weight of official narratives that demanded clarity where only shadows existed. The forgotten massacre of Lvov prison remained locked behind Soviet propaganda and Nazi manipulation, its victims erased twice over. The atrocities of Unit 731 survived only in fragments, traded for immunity in a Cold War bargain that denied justice in the name of science. Operation Werwolf lingered as a phantom, its legacy haunting the strategies of post-war intelligence agencies that borrowed from its blueprint. And the fall of Berlin, long celebrated as the final triumph of arms, revealed hints of negotiation and betrayal, where survival was purchased at the expense of truth. These are not isolated stories. They form a pattern, a reminder that history as we know it is often the product of what governments choose to reveal, not what actually occurred. Every archive stamped "Do not circulate," every page blackened by redaction, every testimony dismissed as propaganda hides another layer of reality. The war that shaped the modern world may have ended 80 years ago, but its buried chapters continue to bleed through the cracks of declassified files, testimony by testimony, fragment by fragment. And the deeper we look, the more unsettling the question becomes. How many more secrets still lie sealed, waiting in silence for the day when history finally dares to confront them?